In December last year, something very strange happened. That in a number of different states around the country, all in the same week, people started to walk into the emergency centres of hospitals with very strange symptoms. Some of them had blurred vision, some of them had unbelievably bad headaches, others were hallucinating, others were just extremely ill. And once they started to realise that all of these were happening in different cities, people started to panic. And they very quickly were trying to work out, is there any connection, any correlation at all between these cases? And after interviewing everybody, they worked out that the one thing they all had in common was that they had been eating salad. Okay, eating salad can be dangerous to you. But particularly, it was salad that had baby spinach. You may have remembered hearing this in the news. And so very quickly, they withdrew everything from the shops. They told everyone to throw out anything they had in their fridge. And they still didn't quite know what it was that the problem. It took a couple of weeks before they started to realise that actually, when they were harvesting this baby spinach, there was a weed in the field at the same time, which was toxic. It's this particular weed called the thorn apple. And when it's small, it looks exactly the same as baby spinach. And so they collected it up, put it in the packets, and no one really knew that what they were packing was seriously toxic. Now, the image that Jesus uses here in the gospel today, he talks about the kingdom of heaven. And it's kind of a powerful image. So let me try and explain the context. Jesus has about 5 or 6 different parables trying to explain what his vision for the world is, what the kingdom could be. He begins with a parable which says, the kingdom is meant to be glorious. It is meant to be amazing. It's meant to nourish people's souls. However, the reality is that the enemy has come into the midst of it and started to plant weeds. And those weeds aren't simply an inconvenience, but they're actually toxic. You know, these weeds can destroy people. Now, like I say, it's a fascinating starting point because Jesus is very realistic about what the state of his church is going to be. Now, when we look at his vision, he wanted the world to be transformed. He wanted his church to be this great powerhouse of love and healing in the world. But we're very aware that it hasn't been that. You know, I don't need to tell you all the horror stories about what the church has done. You know, we're very aware of the sins of the church. You know, and particularly in this recent era we've gone through with the abuse scandals and this realization that it's not only just sexual abuse, but it's abuse of power. You know, I was reading something recently saying that in the list of the top 10 occupations that attract psychopaths, the clergy is at number 8. Okay, there's a problem. And it's a problem that's been with us for 2,000 years. The church is sick. It is meant to be a source of healing, but for so many people, it's a source of pain. And I would love to be able to stand up here and say the problem is us, the leaders. But that's only part of the problem. Because these weeds fill the whole of our community. You know, the enemy has come in and sowed lies into the midst of our church. And there's a point where we need to actually start to recognize that the whole culture of our church is damaging. You know, look around here. There's a good chance you probably don't know most people's names. but you know their faces because they're all regulars. But the reality is that, every week people come here looking for the love of God to be revealed, and they don't feel welcomed. How often does someone come to church at a point when their life is falling apart, and they come and kneel down, and someone comes up to them and says, "You're sitting in my chair"? Because Catholics are very territorial about where they sit. You always sit in the same spot every week, I know. But how often does it happen where someone at the point where their life is falling apart and they're looking for someone to be Christ to them, to reach out and love them, and no one talks. No one even acknowledges that they're there. This is where the weeds are in our church. We are meant to be Christ to the world. We are meant to be bringing his love and his salvation, and yet we're keeping it to ourselves. We're hiding it. Now, if we're going to just name a few of these weeds, I think one of the key things in our culture is this idea that only priests are allowed to do church stuff. And by that I mean praying, leading, preaching, teaching. Now, clearly within the context of the liturgy, there are key roles, okay, and we've got to respect that. But outside of that, you are meant to be ministering. You are meant to be empowered to be able to go and lead Bible studies, to be able to share your faith, to be able to walk up to a person and pray with them. I'm constantly, I'm not sure whether I'm amused or frustrated. The number of times where whenever there's a gathering, no one can start eating until the priest prays grace. Like, you're allowed to pray. You're allowed to lead. Okay, I understand there's a culture of trying to respect the clergy, but we can't have that if it means disrespecting your baptismal calling. That's where the body of Christ is meant to be. In the same way, there can be this culture that parishioners are meant to be like passive sheep. That somehow you glorify God by doing nothing. That is so deep in our culture. That's not the way it's meant to be. This is meant to be a place where you come on Sunday to be fed, but so that you can then go out and feed other people. You were baptized as priest, prophet, and king because you are meant to play a role in the world. This one might sound a little bit sarcastic, but I think sometimes there's this idea that our worship is a greater sacrifice if the liturgy's bad. The sign of a really devout Catholic is that they can go to a church with bad preaching and bad music and still love Jesus. That's not the way it's meant to be. Our liturgies are meant to be a reflection of heaven. The way that we do the music, the way we do the preaching, the way we do the readings, it's meant to be as though we're standing before the throne of heaven. And so this is a big challenge for us. How do we change the culture and try to make this Mass experience as beautiful as we can? Over the last year or so, we've been doing a lot of work with our musicians. And you can see our choir is building exponentially every week. But we also want to start doing a lot of work with our readers. And you're probably going to get an email from me this week about this. To really do some good training, how to make this a powerful proclamation of the word. How do we improve every part of our liturgy? I think maybe one of the biggest weeds in our church is this idea that we should keep the faith to ourselves. That the most loving thing we can do is keep our mouths shut. Whereas we are called to bring life to the world. How do we improve the whole of our experience of church? I don't know whether you can see that from the back, but a classic cartoon where Jesus is giving the disciples a multiple choice quiz. They'll know that you are my disciples. Is it A, the moral superiority, B, the self-righteous indignation, C, the inferior music, or D, because they love one another? It's got to be because we love. And how does each one of you change that culture? How do you start to see your identity as being different? Now, I wanted to use this image. It's a famous icon of Francis of Assisi. If you know the story of Francis, when he had his conversion, he heard God speak to him saying, "Francis, go and rebuild my church." Now, he initially took that literally and started rebuilding the church he was in. But a few years later, he was visiting Rome, getting approval from the Pope for the work that he was doing. And the Pope had a dream. He saw the whole basilica collapsing, and this poor man dressed like a beggar holding the church up, stopping it from falling. And the next day, the Pope saw Francis walking through the courtyard, and he realized that was the man in the dream. And he realized this was the man who was going to rebuild the church. But it's been a call for us ever since. The church is sick. How do we rebuild the church? How do we as a parish start to get a vision for what our mission is here in Darwin, for us here in Australia? How can we become a witness of what the kingdom was meant to be? Now, as I said, a big part of this is that we need to start to change our identity. You're not meant to be passive sheep. Every sheep is meant to become a shepherd. How do you start to hear where the Spirit is calling you to lead in your particular way? Whether that is serving within the Mass or whether that's taking your gifting outside the church to try to share the gospel. And so I think this is the key thing we need to come to. This quote by Pope Francis, he says very clearly, every Christian is called to be a missionary and a witness to Christ. And the church, the community of Christ's disciples, has no other mission than that of bringing the gospel to the entire world by bearing witness to Christ. To evangelize is the very identity of the church. We've got to keep coming back to this. We've got to remember who we are. Okay, the church has no other mission than that of bringing the gospel to the entire world. And so I think the challenge for us is, as a community, how do we grow into that? How does this become our identity? How do we leave the weeds behind? Because when Jesus was saying there in the second parable, he's saying that the kingdom is like a tiny seed that grows into this enormous tree. Or the kingdom is like a little bit of yeast in flour, and it influences the whole of the dough. You are meant to be that yeast in the world. You're not meant to be a bunch of scared Christians hiding, trying to keep your faith to yourselves. You're meant to be changing the way the world thinks. So for us as a parish, we're really trying to launch into a strong vision of how do we change this vision? How do we change this sense of identity? Now, the key part of this is we need to realize that we're not meant to stay as we are. Sadly, for most Catholics, the journey of Christianity is a bit of a dead end, in the sense that you get baptized as a baby, and then no one really expects anything of you ever again. As long as you occasionally go to church, we're happy. We don't care whether you grow. We don't care whether you know how to pray. And that's tragic. Because the Christian life is meant to be a journey. It's meant to be a journey of constant growth. And so this is where we want to start talking about this idea of having a pathway of discipleship. That every parishioner understands that they're on a journey, growing in faith, growing in their calling from God. And so we want to try and provide a way that you can go from one step to another. How does a person go from that initial experience of being curious to then actually discovering and encountering Christ? But then to come to a place where you journey together in small groups and actually encourage each other to grow, to learn the faith, until you get to a point where you feel equipped to be able to then share your faith with other people. Now, you're going to hear a lot of talk about this over the next year, because we're going to be starting to try to implement some of these things around small groups and faith formation. Some of this stuff we've already been doing for a while. One of the key things in this process is having a place where you can grow in leadership, but other people can also grow in faith. Now, one of the key things we want to try and do here is using this thing of the Alpha Course. You've been hearing me talk about this for the last couple of weeks. In fact, you've probably heard us talk about this for years, and you've thought, okay, it's just another church course, whatever. Now, we've been running Alpha for the last couple of years. Alpha is basically a video series about the basics of Christianity, how to understand the essence of the mystery of salvation, but then also how to grow in prayer, reading the scriptures, living as a Christian. As I say, we've been running this for about 4 years, but we have never run it correctly. And what I mean by that is that we have been running this course really just as another faith formation retreat. And parishioners come to it and they say, yeah, that's great. What's next? It's not actually the way it's meant to work. The way it's meant to work is that we invite parishioners into a team to run this course. And really what that is, it's a training in leadership. This becomes a whole pipeline of developing leaders within the parish. Because once again, we don't want you to be passive sheep. So what we really want is to be able to invite people in who can be leading small groups, who can be organizing the event and developing hospitality. And through that, developing your gifting so that you can actually then use that elsewhere. But the other side of this is that this event is not primarily for parishioners. What this is about is a place where you can invite people in. This is a really simple way to share your faith. If I was to tell you to go out and evangelize, the first thing you would say is, I've never studied theology. I don't know what the answers are. If people ask me hard questions, I'm useless. The beauty of this is that you don't need to know the answers. You just have to be able to invite someone and say, come along to this retreat with me. It's trying to make evangelization as easy as possible. And then once they've experienced this, we can then invite them into the next stage, into the next part of faith formation, into a small group, into a way where they can grow in that journey. So you're going to hear a lot of us talk about Alpha over the next couple of years. And I want you to start to realize how this is really going to be central to what we do as a parish. If our mission is to evangelize, we need a tool to allow us to evangelize. And so we're going to try and use this as our key tool. So, just as we go forward from here, just to really pray about how can we respond to that grace of God, to rebuild the church, to bring his life into the world.